Deb Cushing, you're back. Day 2, and as I said, you know, she's the expert this time in intergenerational design in public green spaces, and she's going to share her knowledge so that we can apply those learnings from her nation-leading transdisciplinary and cross-sector project to encourage Canberra's generations to play together. And she's also a fancy associate professor. I like to say that. Thanks, Deb.
Really, if you saw me on the weekend, you would not think I was fancy. All right, so I'm going to do this a little bit different than today. All right, thank you, everyone, and thank you for welcoming me back. So yes, I am going to present a different project than what I presented yesterday, and this is about intergenerational parks. So I would like to, before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people and all First Nations peoples on whose lands we gather, and all First Nations peoples who are with us today. The project I am going to be presenting, it is research, and we did it with Moreton Bay Regional Council, which, if you're not familiar with Queensland, it's just above Brisbane. It's before you get to the Sunshine Coast and Noosa and fabulousness. So the Moreton Bay Regional Council, they were our partners, and so I do want to acknowledge and pay my respects to Kabi Kabi, the Yinabara, the Yagara, and Turrbal traditional custodians and their elders past, present, and emerging. Okay, so as Kathy mentioned, this was sort of a very transdisciplinary multiple partner project. It was funded by the Australian Research Council Linkage Project, and if anyone's interested, so universities do apply for those. They're very, very competitive, but it's great in that it actually links industry. So we had Playscape Creations, we had Seven Senses Foundation, we had Conrad Gargett, which is an architecture firm. So we had lots of practitioners. We also had Moreton Bay Regional Council, the Heart Foundation, and the National Wellness Institute. So it's a great way to actually ensure that we can partner and get funding and actually do the research so then have meaningful outcomes. So I won't go through my partners. You probably don't know many of them, but it was, so we have planning, landscape architecture, health, people who are experts in physical activity. Obviously we had the Heart Foundation, so we had lots of different expertise. So a lot of people say, well, we've had parks for ages. Don't we already know how to design parks? And yes, we do. You know, there's some great parks out there, and you know, my favorite is Central Park in New York City, and you know, it was designed long, long ago, and it's great. But what we actually need, so why the reason we need research is because, you know, our society is changing. Even how, you know, in the last 3 years, things have changed so much with COVID and everything. But we really need that evidence, so that's why we need the research. Evidence-based strategies are really critical to ensure these parks are effectively designed for all ages. And I do want to preface this, but we focused on different age groups rather than different cultures or different, you know, accessibility and mobility and that kind of thing. And that does come with the age factor, but that is what we focused on. So just to preface that. So when I came to Australia about 11 years ago, and so these are just some images of, and I'm talking about suburban parks, not the well-funded inner cities like South Bank Parkland, which Betty mentioned, which, you know, amazing, but well-funded, like they spent a lot of money on that park, and it's amazing. So these are the suburban parks where they're in our neighborhoods, they're in our communities, and they're often really a little bit bland. They don't have a lot of interest for different age groups. You know, when I came here, my daughter was 1, so I visited a lot of these parks, and I was just shocked because there wasn't that much to do, and then also a lot of, you know, there wasn't anything for me to do to be physically active. So this is a smattering of, you know, like 5 parks right in the area that I was living. And they all look very similar. There's not a lot of interest. And you'll notice that there's actually not a lot of pathways, and even though there are a few pathways here and there, so I do acknowledge that, you know, obviously that my photo doesn't show everything in the park. You know, this in one very, you know, popular suburb, this is the extent of the, you know, playground equipment. So it's great to have that open space, and again, I want to preface that, this wasn't about the ecological, the ecosystem services, the wildlife habitat, the flooding mitigation, all those other things that we get from a park. This was more about the human use and the physical activity and the social engagement. So when we started, we sort of, obviously there's research that has been done in Australia on this topic. So we found that, suburban parks were really non-stimulated, and other research has found this, and lacked challenging equipment for all ages, especially the youth age group. They're the sort of leftover group that, doesn't get designed for as much as sort of the young children. Now, the second point, so park visitors, research has found that park visitors are actually often sedentary, and adults are usually supervising children's activities rather than being active themselves. So that's not a problem in and of itself, because, I'm a big believer in going to a park and sitting and, people watching or resting or having a picnic and not being active. So that's lovely. It's when you actually look at this with the other two factors that, maybe there's something we can do. So, and this is pre-COVID numbers, but 55% of Australian adults and 70% of children do not meet physical activity guidelines. And that's 2 to 17 years, so it's a broad range of kids. Again, if you look at the youth percentages, it's way, way higher. It's astounding how many young people, like in the teenage years, don't get enough physical activity. And whatever physical activity means, obviously there are guidelines, so we did want to be a little bit open about the mobility and kind of what this means, but that's what we were going on. So if people are not being active enough, and we have all these parks that are not being used enough, how can we combine the two? So our approach was using this theory, again, I talk about theories a lot, but affordance theory, and it's really those opportunities, a little bit like nudges, but it's more broad. There's opportunities for activities that we have in our environment, like a chair, there's an opportunity to sit, but that might be what I see. So a child might actually see that it's an opportunity for a little table or hiding under or whatever. So you actually have to think about the individual or group characteristics as well. And there needs to be cues. So how something is designed indicates how we might be able to use it. So we have the affordances, and as we heard yesterday, people who are socially connected to friends and family are happier and live longer. So we did want that social engagement. We wanted to encourage that. And we did use an approach called salutogenic, and that really focuses on the health promotion rather than sort of the pathogenic, which we, addressing the disease. We absolutely need both in our communities because that's what, or in our society. But we wanted to focus on how do we promote the healthy activities. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what affordances are, so they actually have to have design cues, so they signal what we can do. So they give permission for activities, essentially. So the zebra crossing or the pedestrian crossing. So this is a design feature that we have in our environment, but you actually have to, it's either culturally learned or age, depending on how old you are, you have to learn how to use that. Okay, because this was research, and I won't go into this too much detail, but this was a 4-year project, and we did systematic observations in the parks. We chose 12 parks in, they were suburban, residential neighborhood, and community parks in Moreton Bay. So we did observations of who was using the park, what they were doing, how active they were, who they were with, that kind of thing. We wanted to make sure we didn't just understand what people were doing in the parks because not enough people were in the parks. So we actually went to shopping centers that were nearby those 12 parks and we did interviews. So we had over 600 respondents, so across different ages. We did only, because of ethics, we did only ask adults, but we did ask about children's use. And we also used a photo choice tool. So they had photos where they could choose what scenes would attract them to the park. And then with that data, when we analyzed it, we then did design workshops or design charrettes. And so we got people in, not only our partners, but people from their agencies. So from Moreton Bay Regional Council or from Playscape Creations to come in and kind of come up with design ideas that we could actually use. So our objectives, when we got our findings. Basically, first is to entice people to the park. So what can we do to get them out there? Because if they're not there, it doesn't even matter how the design, what the design has, they're just not using the park. So first it was, how do we entice them to the park, and all ages? How do we enable them to be physically active, so whatever that means for them? And then how do we engage them socially to make sure that it's not just, and no shame in doing this, but the kids are playing and adults are on their phone, or, and that's fine if you need to do that, great, if that's a chance for you to, you're stressed and you need to just have your kids play, great, but, how can we make sure everyone has a chance to socially engage? So just a little selection of the findings, and I do want to say, this is the guidelines, and there's a lot in here, so I'm just presenting a small little bit of what we found. And I do have a few copies printed, so I can share a few of those. But
it's available online too.
It is available completely online, so yep. So the number one thing, and we, of course, we do all this research and get, a grant to do this, and we want groundbreaking findings. And what we found was that it was pathways. So well-designed pathways are critical in parks. So all those images that I showed of the typical suburban park, they didn't really have pathways to get to, the play spaces. Or again, and what Betty mentioned was, like walking on the grass is not always convenient, easy. Sometimes it's wet. Sometimes with mobility challenges, you actually can't. If you have a pram and 3 kids, you can't walk through the grass. So having pathways was really critical. So a few of the things we found were, and I apologize that these are small, but 65% of adults currently walk for physical activity. That was their top choice for the activity above going to the gym, doing yoga, whatever. And dog walking was kind of in there as second. So walking and having paths to walk on is just so important in our communities. We actually have to spend more money and more time to really think about connections, how we design them, making sure they're smooth, wide enough. I mean, wide enough. I don't know about Canberra. I think you have pretty wide streets and sidewalks. But in Brisbane, you have a 1 meter path, or, it just, you can't do anything, and then it stops. So it's not good. So pathways, and those were also provided opportunities for the intergenerational. So it was, the kids could ride the bikes or the scooters, and the parents or the caregivers could walk. So if you could walk together, that was ideal. Next, we found that playgrounds are a draw card to a park, definitely, and not all parks have playgrounds, so they're not the same thing. But we really need to provide adults with options to be active too. So the playgrounds were great for kids. That was actually usually the location in the park where the kids were most active, which was not surprising, but so it was the playground. And adults with children were more likely to choose a park with a playground than one without. So, that's their choice, is where they go. So playgrounds are pretty critical. And what we found was adults kept saying that children decide what they do in the playground. So it gives them a little bit of agency. It gives them, a chance to sort of do what they want, and the adults just let them do it. So it was, rather than the no, 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 don't do that, don't touch that, it was a chance for kids to actually have a little bit of control over what was happening. But what we did find was there was limited opportunities for adults. So they were often left, they either didn't feel comfortable playing. It wasn't, if you've ever tried to sit on a swing that's designed for a kid, it doesn't, you don't really fit, or it's not very comfortable. So there wasn't a lot of opportunities. So we have some design ideas to address that, but that is one thing that we did find that we really need to do better in making sure there's opportunities. So, and again, I appreciate the, references to nature play. That's really great. So one of the things we did find when we showed people photos was the scenes of nature can effectively encourage people just to be active in the parks. It's what they go for. And later on, I have an image of the top photo that was chosen, and you'll see kind of what people were interested in. So open playing fields can be valuable, and obviously they're important for sports or matches or games and that kind of thing. That's important. But open playing fields in a park can be valuable, but they often need more cues about possible activities. So I'm sure some of you are really, you see an open playing field and you can just go and do stuff. You have like 20 activities that you know what to do. But there's a lot of people who just, they don't know what to do in that space. So they need actually more cues, whether it is signs or how we design, like a cricket pitch is one thing, but then if you don't have the stuff to play cricket, there's nothing to do. So we do need more cues on that end. But it was an opportunity to play for intergenerational activities. What we did find was actually the respondents who identified as male were more likely to use the playing fields than female. So that was one interesting finding, although probably not surprising in some sense. And people, sometimes people were happy to bring their own equipment if they needed, like the balls and bats and things. But one of the design ideas was actually to have that where you could either rent it or you could, borrow it and make sure that there was equipment there. And that might be one of the cues to have in the park. Okay, so one of the critical things was the intergenerational interactions don't automatically happen. So we found a lot of people, they just didn't automatically engage. When we were observing them, it was just, kind of separate. So opportunities really need to be afforded to enable multiple generations to be active together. And again, I just want to say, again, this is really focused on the social engagement and the physical activity. So those two sort of concepts or, forms of activity, what we're doing in the park. Another finding, and again, this might be different in Brisbane or in Queensland than in here in Canberra, but more people were present in the parks in the early afternoon, probably when kids get out of school. But a higher percentage of park visitors were physically active in the morning. And so it's looking at that if we really want, nothing's wrong with that, those statistics at all. But it's looking, if we want more people to be active, what do we need to do to enable it, to enable them to be active when they're there anyway? So in the afternoon, and so in Queensland, we actually need a lot of shade. So maybe it's too hot to be physically active in the afternoon, or maybe that's when you're tired, so actually having a coffee cart would be a great thing, and then they can be active. Or, whatever it is actually figuring out, what can we do to change that? So the design guide, again, this is sort of the guide here. So what we put together, and we created this guide because obviously academic research sometimes is not very accessible. Who cares about the academic articles other than us? It's a checkbox and that's it. It's important, don't get me wrong, but, we wanted to make sure it was usable by our partners, definitely councils, that kind of thing. And really, again, it wasn't, stuff we didn't necessarily know. It was more that now we have evidence to support that. And so because, funding is obviously spread thin in different places, the parks, and you saw the parks, near where I live, they don't always get a lot of funding. And so it's if we can have evidence to support some of these design decisions and, putting funding toward improving a park, that's what has been really valuable. And that's what our council partners have said. So the key sections, pathway, and this is sort of in order of importance. So again, we found that pathways were critical, so we put that first and really focused on that a little bit more than the others. Playgrounds, then open playing fields, and then dog off-leash areas, which were important, but not as important for these two, social engagement and physical activity. Outdoor exercise areas, again, not as important, but definitely still a factor. And then other activity areas like basketball courts and community gardens. So for each of those different sections, we have evidence-based recommendations, and I'm not going to go through them all, but it's anything from affording, more physical activity, for both social and physical skills, or considering under, around, and in between. Again, thinking about the characteristics, kids like to crawl under, and, can you get up high, different things like that, to providing shade, or, considering the playground location within the park, is it adjacent to, places where adults can do things, so co-locating maybe the exercise equipment with the playground so you can kind of watch each other, that kind of thing. So that's what we focused on. So the overriding message was that intergenerational play can happen throughout the whole park, but deliberate opportunities and cues need to be designed to make it happen. So then we got to the fun part, which was the design ideas. So again, I've just, we did design ideas for every different area. So this is just a smattering, just an example. So graduated challenges, again, what we found was the adults who were there with the kids, they were assisting, sometimes playing, but oftentimes observing. And so if you have graduated challenges where there's a little bit of risk involved, or the kids are actually testing sort of their, they have those developmental tasks that they're working through. And so, if they're sort of testing their limits, giving them a little bit of support was actually one way that we could have that social interaction. So we do see some of this, but play equipment designed for adults and children together. I think we need more of this, and it's not to say we don't need the equipment that's just for the kids. That's great too. But if we can find ways to have more of sort of where that we can partner, I often think like a seesaw or teeter-totter that has like weights you can move, because obviously the adults weigh more than the kids, and if you can kind of actually even make it into a math problem that you can figure out how do you balance out, something like cool stuff like that. I think we're creative, people can come up with great ideas, we just actually have to make it happen. Again, like rather than the single slide where one person goes down and then it's too skinny, we can have where lots of people, and adults as well, go down that. Again, for addressing different mobility issues or accessibility, so making sure that we see a lot of these swings where it's sort of the what do they call that, Liberty swing, that's in a fenced off, and for it's heavy and it would be dangerous if kids got hit by it, and there are reasons why it is sort of fenced off and you sometimes need to go get a key to unlock it, but it's not very inclusive. So if we can find ways that can be more inclusive, and we can I don't know how much either of these costs, I haven't priced it out, but yeah, just looking into that. Sort of cultural symbols or different ways, working with those groups to, whoever's living around that community park, making sure that there's culturally appropriate symbols that are represented, and it's not tokenistic. Again, wide pathways that enable shared use, that is just so critical. And making sure they're smooth and they're accessible. This was just to give you a sample in the nature, and they weren't all like this. Some were very traditional, sort of some of the photos, but this was the top photo that people chose. This is what that would get them to a park, and this is on the Brisbane River. Actually, it's in a it's actually part of an arboretum, so but it's a park. There's a playground, and actually one of those photos is from this area. But that was what people wanted. Having signs, rather than the don't do this, having signs that encourage, for running, jumping, and playing only, and actually I think there's this great park on the Gold Coast that actually has one of those bouncy pillows, and of course some woman sued the city, but anyway, you always get that. But I think, rather, they have the list of rules and, everything, and that's, you need that. But like, why not say, adults are encouraged to actually bounce with their kids, right? So, because I want to bounce, like I'm an active person, and I really want to bounce, but I feel like intimidated, or I feel like, oh, the parents are gonna look at me funny, like why are their parents on there? So, but if we could actually have signs and cues and things to encourage this to happen, I think why not, What we found with the play equipment is that a lot of times you'll have those outdoor exercise areas, and the kids are all playing on the equipment, right? Because it looks cool and it's fun and stuff. And so why not have equipment that's designed for kids beside what's designed for adults? Or have some way that, again, both can, help each other. So the adults are raising the kids, instead of using weights, you put your kid on and, like different things to do. So that is one thing we did find. And then making sure things are multi-use. So it's not just a one use, making sure, and they have to be cues to say that that's allowed. Because otherwise, some people are just going to do it, that, they're bold and they just, we'll use it for whatever, but other people may be more reserved, or then you'll have the other person say, oh, you're not supposed to be doing that, why are you doing that? So it's actually making it okay and giving permission, so it's that affordance that we need to kind of work on. And that's it. So thank you.